You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the podcast helping water leaders to discover solutions and drive change. I'm the host, Travis Loop. This episode comes to you from the Reservoir Center for Water Solutions in Washington, D.C., where Waterloop is a media partner.
The federal government's historic investment in water infrastructure has presented both opportunities and challenges. The solution lies in efficiently distributing funds, overcoming barriers like permitting and regulatory requirements, and accelerating the pace of project implementation. In this episode, Tim Mayle, Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, discusses the complexity of rolling out billions in federal funding and the hurdles still in place. He highlights the need for technical assistance, environmental finance centers, and better systems to ensure long-term success. Topics also include the urgency of lead pipe replacement, regionalization of utilities, and leveraging nature-based solutions for watershed management.
Well, Tim, we are sitting here in the nation's capital at the Reservoir Center, a very short distance from the Capitol building itself. Let's talk a little bit about federal policy, federal programs, how things are going. There's been a lot happening in water the past few years. I'm really curious about the bipartisan infrastructure law, this historic amount of funding, all this attention for water. What's your assessment of how the rollout of that is going?
Yeah, it's a lot of money, right? 60 billion just in the kind of EPA part of the spectrum, not looking at environmental justice money, not looking at Department of Interior water money. There's so much money. And the reality is I think it's been, I would give it like a C in terms of getting money out the door.
Okay.
And rising, getting better.
Okay.
Because it was so much money that the government appropriately didn't have systems in place to deal with it. Then we've got permitting issues, right, that have always existed, at least for major projects that involve things like Clean Water Act. And then Congress layered in a bunch of things like jobs requirements and American steel requirements that made delivering that money harder in a lot of ways. So a lot of it really has kind of yet to hit the streets, and you hear about that in political context, like how much money is making it out to states. We still have a long way to go, but I think we're at this kind of inflection point. For me, the piece is that, one, there's been some big political priorities, and as is true with any administration, they put more people on those, and more people kind of muscle to push stuff through is effective. So that's been a good part. We are a named environmental finance center from EPA, which is awesome from our perspective. But an environmental finance center, or technical assistance writ large, is basically like we've taken an Olympic track and put hurdles on it, and we've now got somebody standing next to the hurdle giving you a boost to get over it, right? Like, we're not taking the hurdles down, we're just helping people get over them. That is working. It's starting to work faster, I think, and there's many EFCs, dozens of EFCs. There's, outside of EPA, there's tribal-focused EFCs for other money. Technical assistance has been really key, and embedding that into programs permanently is, I think, a key part of helping the success keep going. And so I think that's a positive piece. I think the taking down the barriers and the hurdles has been a place where it's still a work in progress. And you see all this action on permitting reform, bipartisan bills in both Senate and House, and the White House as well engaged. And I think that's a legitimate effort at lowering, instead of being 3 feet tall, they're 2.5 feet tall, right? Like more people can jump over them.
Yeah. So, maybe to someone like me or others, you see this bipartisan infrastructure law, you see the big money, you see 5 years, and we're already halfway through that or a couple years into it. Yeah. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time to lower hurdles, to bring people along. But could you maybe explain how that's not quite the case? I mean, isn't the money going to take a little bit longer to come out? Help me understand the nuance here.
Yeah, I mean, it is complicated. 5 years is longer than 5 years because, they appropriately, Congress gives agencies a little bit more time than the strict period of the law to get it spent. But it's not a lot more time, right? Maybe it's not 5 years, it's 7, 8 years in some cases, but that's still going by fast. And here we are, 3 years, 2.5 years into that spend down. Yeah. So the clock is ticking, right? So one earlier source of money was from ARPA, the COVID-related recovery package, and the clock on that is December 31st of this year, and there's apparently still quite a bit of money that was allocated to states that has not yet been put to use that people are scrambling, to spend. And so I really hope we don't get there with the bill money, the bipartisan infrastructure law money, and then the IRA monies, where we're at the end and we're like desperately trying to spend. Like, it would be much better to have gotten it done as we go.
Well, it makes me think of the idea that if the country can take this money, especially the water sector, spend it well, spend it wisely, create change, well, maybe that will lead to another infusion of money, right? You want to show that you can use funding wisely and then see if you can get more.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, federal money, it does create jobs, right? Because there's people who spend it. So that's a good thing. And there legitimately are, hundreds of examples around the country now of places that can show a before and after of what it means to spend this money on, a major street redesign for stormwater features, or a new wastewater treatment plant, or pipes to connect, a small struggling water utility with a bigger one. And they're now, one or at least co-managed infrastructure. Like, there's lots of successes, but not as many as we'd need. And we work a lot on lead pipe replacement. And what I think is the nice thing about lead pipe replacement is that there aren't a lot of complicated permitting requirements like NEPA, right? There's not a big environmental impact statement around lead pipe replacement. I really think about the moment when we get to the millionth lead pipe replaced, but also just financed, right?
Wow.
Once the dollar for the millionth pipe goes out the door, there's roughly 9 to 10 million pipes. We're a tenth of the way there. That is a moment to celebrate. I wish we were there now. There's not great data on this. I also wish we had that data. But maybe in 2 to 3 years, because it is speeding up, we would be at the point where we could say, states and others have now, with federal money, have now put out the plans to replace, the first million pipes. And that's a huge public health win.
Well, I was recently in Milwaukee talking to them about their lead pipes, and they've been able to basically quadruple their pace because of these funds, and also do it at no cost to the homeowner.
Yep.
So that's a great success story. But they are really just hitting that upward pace right now.
Yeah.
What about the systems change that needs to happen beyond just this tranche of funds, right? The narrative and the truth is that these communities have always struggled to get the money because they don't have the staff to go get it, whatever it might be. What about the efforts to really address that and change the systems for the long term, not just this bill era?
Yeah, I mean,
maybe that's where environmental finance centers and technical assistance providers come in over the long haul, but also the lowering of the hurdles, like you said, right?
Right. I would say there's some good news and bad news, which is, we've always been able to, or for many years, we've been able to document this massive gap in how much infrastructure money we need. Well, that means people have had plans to identify the things they want to build, right? So there actually is a little bit of a needs assessment across water infrastructure, and that's a good thing. That's a starting place. Then you've got this kind of large amount of project money, big $10 million or $100 million projects that are going on now. And as you know, a lot of that infrastructure is stuff you build and then it's there for 20 to 30 years. The question that's going to come up in the near future is, what about the funds that continue to operate it, right? So how do we use technology to do that smarter? And we've got to have far more kind of remote operations, just like you can be in a rural area and get a doctor on the phone or the screen. We've got to have more water systems that are operating with technology that allows them to use a very different distribution of staff capacity and expertise. And I don't think we've really tackled that at a federal level yet, although there's lots of utilities that are amazing bright spots.
One aspect of that is, regionalization, consolidation, pool resources also. Use technology or use the people that you have across more systems.
I love regionalization, and I'd love to see more states basically make it harder to create new utilities right now, like to kind of turn off the hot water so we can turn on the cold water. Maybe that was the hot one of regionalization. Because it is pretty hard to bring utilities together. Things like safe harbors so that the utility that's taking on more responsibility is taking on more liability, but it's not liability that immediately has a regulatory consequence, right? Like the last thing you want is for a utility that's just figured out how to help another one all of a sudden discover they're in violation of something
Wasn't
because
even
of the
their
infrastructure,
fault.
and it wasn't their fault.
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
that is not a recipe for success in regionalization. So,
Huh.
and there's really promising, actions and efforts underway to make that easier and less full of risk.
I spoke to Shelley Chard from Oklahoma, runs their drinking water program, a few months ago, earlier this year, and I think she said that they've gone from like 16 or 1,500 systems down to around 1,200. So they're, that's a 25% reduction. That's
Yeah.
progress. That's
Yeah.
what needs to be happening for sure. Still some kind of conversation that's not supposed to really be had, right? It's still like this third rail for some reason.
Yeah.
But whatever.
I know. Well, it would be like telling two little communities in the middle of the country somewhere they're supposed to join. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's also pretty hard to tell them that.
True. Well, speaking of third rails of conversation, let's talk politics for a second.
Sure.
but so again, we're right here in Washington D.C. This is an election year. Change of who is in the White House as far as the person, either way. What do you think from the past 4 years should be extended and continue on to the next administration, maybe regardless of who is in that White House?
Yeah. Well, let me talk about the state revolving loan funds and the municipal bond market. And I don't want to mention those two things side by side because one of the big policy areas of policy action has been toward disadvantaged or struggling communities, right? And those are often communities that cannot access the municipal bond market, right? Municipal bond supported by taxpayers, right, at the end of the day, because we're giving up the ability to collect tax on the bonds. Massive amounts of money, lots of larger communities and well-resourced communities have been tapping into that for a long time. Really successful piece of public policy with private and public investment. The SRFs are meant to be a parallel track to that fills a different niche as opposed to replacing it. And so I think the policy push to really look at the communities that need the SRF versus ones that have a fine time working with the muni bond market has been a really positive thing. So if you imagine trying to keep that path going and keep growing, both of those pots, that's something that I have now seen. We have seen a lot of progress toward more of the SRF money going to communities that a state categorizes as disadvantaged. That's a big win, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's like a 15 percentage point bump up in disadvantaged communities getting money. That is a massive success.
Sure, and that's probably something that can continue in the upward climb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can continue, but there's not a guarantee that it's going to continue.
Because that's just a policy decision,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
There's nothing codified around that or directed.
Right.
Yeah.
The White House President Biden set EJ40, a 40% goal, but it is just a White House goal, right? It's not in law. And a bunch of the other pieces that helped make that pattern happen are also softer, policy rather than harder policy. So, a next administration has a chance to say, we like that. There's, a lot of funding to go around, and this is a way to make sure it gets to more communities in more parts of the country with a much different kind of set of base capacities. So I think that's one of the most important things for a new administration to focus on is just kind of locking in that approach to the distribution of the SRFs.
And those are red and blue communities, right? Those
Yeah.
ones that are struggling. It's these
Yep.
little urban areas, rural communities, whoever. Yeah.
Yeah. It is not partisan.
Yeah.
The list of communities that need help. So.
Okay. Anything else, worth kind of trying to continue over?
For me, the biggest things that I think about are, we're talking about how well is the infrastructure spend working, but we get a chance to decide as those the 2 or 3 big infrastructure bills expire, are we going to do it again? And my vote is yes, we should do it again. But what does that look like? It's really crucial to document the successes of the last 5 to 6 years in order to make that case to Congress. Right? The worst thing to do is just to tell them that we used to think the infrastructure backlog was pick the number 100 billion a year, and now it's 200, right? Like, if you want to demotivate somebody, that's the worst thing to do. We have to show that we're making progress. But there's also pieces like the reauthorization of the SRFs, which has got to happen every few years anyway. It's just a routine part of the law that enables the SRFs. So that's another key moment that's going to happen in the next administration, that there needs to be a White House and obviously a congressional perspective on. But there's a lot of, it's to me, when I talk to people, I work in like conservation and wildlife and ecosystem stuff, and including today, I just got asked by a former interior official if he could give me a call and ask me about these state revolving funds and how they work and whether they could have them on the conservation side, right? Like, I think of them as one of my favorite programs, 100 of my favorite programs, because all states have 2 of them, that work incredibly well. And while there's a lot of drama and the money doesn't get out as fast as we would always like, it's mostly full of successes of building new stuff, rebuilding old stuff better.
Has water infrastructure become more bipartisan the past bunch of years here? The idea of investing in communities, spending money, getting people working.
Good question. I don't know, because of course there's some House of Representatives proposals that would dramatically cut funding for that program. So that's a negative signal. At the same time, there's plenty of both red and blue states that love their state revolving funds, that legitimately put their own resources in it, that leverage those funds. So they're going to the bond market, bringing in even more capital. So, it's always been pretty bipartisan. Little worried about some of the signals, very worried about earmarking of the SRFs. We could, do a whole podcast on that. We may have done one, but
I have not, so that's interesting.
Earmarking the SRFs is such a mistake, right?
Yeah. Tell me more.
Well, you've got states that have always run these programs. The states have a system to identify communities that need help. They have a project, process to bring projects in to help put in place all the planning necessary to build projects, and there's a selection process, and the selection criteria are clear. And along comes Congress and said, we're not going to do this as a loan. We're going to take the money out of the loan program and use it one-off for this community that I picked out of a hat. Right. So it's killing the long-term future of the state revolving loan fund. Literally, there's a community at some point in the future that would have gotten that money that Congress is taking from that future community to give to this one today. And then there's no process, right? It's standard politics, like who has the relationship, who pays for the lobbyist. It's not going to work out equitably. And if you look at the list of SRFs, you can find the richest communities in California, Texas, and Florida lining up to get earmarks. And you still see some of that in the standard state project lists, but at least it's a fair process. So their project has to justify itself first.
And that goes completely counter to what you were saying about the increase of SRFs going to those disadvantaged communities that have not been able to tap into that before.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
even going to pile on further on that problem.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. And it would be entirely appropriate for a member of Congress to say, we're tired of not getting any credit for this money. Invite us to some ribbon cuttings and have the state invite them to ribbon cuttings, right? Like, that's what they need. They want credit. They deserve it because they put a big chunk of the money into the program. If they want to create a process to make sure communities get fairly considered, a way for members of Congress to flag projects for states, to get them in the state queue. But it just makes no sense. It's a really dumb idea to take a loan program and pull the money out of the loan program and make grants to pet communities that congressional offices like.
At a ribbon cutting, or dare I say, a favor for a lobbyist or a campaign contributor, right?
Yeah, and I think it has a backlash. So you can, in many states, not all states, you can literally see the list of communities that are next in line for money. And so you can say, okay, Congress just took $30 million from Texas. Who was going to get the money? And you can name all those communities and you can call their mayors and say, how do you feel about the fact that you were next in line to get a $20 million loan and Congress just took that and gave it to
Houston,
your neighbor, right? Your football rival.
Yeah.
Right? That's where it's headed.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bad look for Congress.
Sure.
So it's, usually they're taking money from someone unnamed and invisible, but in this program they're taking money from a very specific community that's usually a constituent.
How long has this been going on?
It's been getting worse for 3 years.
Okay.
It's kind of.
And now it just has momentum.
Yeah, it's like 50% of the program now is pulled into earmarks of the base. The SRF numbers get complicated, but basically the base amount is getting pulled into earmarks.
So regardless of who's in the White House for this next administration, what would be some asks from your side? What do you think are some new things, some initiatives, some things that have to be addressed?
Yeah, you may have, you probably know about Denver Water putting money into the Watershed to protect their water supply, their drinking water supply, from the effects of wildfire and creating massive runoff problems. Initiatives like that at a watershed scale, at West it's for wildfire and quality management in the east or the south, and the Midwest it might be flood, risk reduction. But it is still too hard to finance nature-based solutions effectively, including ones on private land, but also ones that are on public land, government, both federal land and then state and local lands. So that's an area where Congress making it much easier to do that large-scale nature-based solution work would be fantastic, right? So a $100 million bond or $20 million SRF loan. It should be more
to put in what kind of solution, like wetlands that could capture stormwater before it gets down to this community,
Exactly.
or do the type of work you need to do to reduce wildfire risk in the foothills of mountains or whatever that type of thing is.
Exactly, right.
Okay.
It's large scale work on a that uses some feature of nature to provide water treatment or supply benefits.
Well, and like the ROI on nature-based solutions is tremendous, right? You're not doing this big, huge, crazy gray infrastructure, these multi-$100 million, billion-dollar projects. It's much cheaper. It's that ounce of prevention, pound of cure formula a lot of times.
Yeah, completely agree. So and because of Supreme Court ruling around wetlands and streams, right? A lot of the headwaters that used to have federal protection don't have protection anymore. So managing risk to water supply and places like that through land protection, which you can do under the SRFs nationally, and some states have made it a designated use. That's an area that could use more support. So that's one area that I would say deserves more attention. You mentioned Milwaukee before, and as a city that's rapidly ramped up its lead pipe replacement speed, and I think there's places that are doing 1,000 or 5,000 a year. And for me, that's a yardstick that you should have names of places on. Who's going the fastest? How are they going fast? Small places should be able to compete with large places, basically in terms of speed of execution of lead pipe replacement. And that's something that deserves more attention, like lowering the cost. Is it $7,000? Is it $10,000? Is it $27,000 per lead pipe? So we should be driving down unit costs to do a very simple project and speeding up the pace of delivery. And it should be
and a friendly competition.
A friendly competition, right?
Yeah.
And it should be one that individual plumbers are involved in as well as big engineering companies. And a little too often it's been just big companies and fewer little plumbing businesses that are getting the attention. But it really is a space that should be a very equitable playing field for lots of small and large American businesses to compete to accelerate lead pipe replacement.
Yeah.
I really I like my favorite goal, the thing that I kind of live for in this moment is that millionth lead pipe being replaced. And it's there. The money is there for it, right?
Yeah.
You and I just haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Who's counting? Who's counting? Hopefully EPA is counting.
Hopefully someone tells EPA they should be counting it, and every state as well.
Anything else you'd love to see kind of come up in this next cycle of Congress or administration?
Yeah.
I'm sure you have a laundry list, but big stuff.
I do have a laundry list. Permitting, we may see some permitting reform during the lame duck session of Congress between now and the end of the year. But making it easier to approve projects is a really crucial aspect of policy right now. I mean, it takes 4 years on average for the Army Corps to approve a wetland restoration. That's a green project, right? A green project that's designed to produce environmental benefits takes 4 years to review. Army Corps just took some actions earlier this week to try to make their existing deadlines enforceable by themselves, by the Army Corps, by the leadership of the Army Corps, which love that. But that's one example, just kind of speeding up projects and focusing environmental review and permitting on really big stuff. Like we'd like to see a lot more basically almost like licensing systems where if you've proven yourself really good at a nature-based solution or installing permeable pavement, that you don't have to ask for permission. You just have to document your work afterwards. I think of it as like taking a kid from high school where you're making sure they're doing homework every night to the kid goes off to college and you know what that college is known for, but they're on their own. Like our permitting systems need to look a lot more like college than they do like high school.
But that kid has some track record of performing,
Yes.
and you're like, okay,
Exactly.
you're gonna go now, and
Yep.
you're gonna go do this, and I have confidence that you're gonna do a pretty good
Right.
job, right?
Right, but there's a leap of faith involved, right? And we need more leaps of faith in delivering water infrastructure.
Yeah, well, I have a junior in high school right now, so I'm feeling that analogy a lot.
Good, I have a senior, so.
Oh, here we
yeah,
go.
same
This is
thing.
why we're on this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
We've talked about lead a bunch during this conversation, and that's been a major target for this administration. What does it mean? How does it affect policy? How does it affect implementation when the White House comes out and sets a target on something?
Yeah, I think before I moved to Washington, I would have thought that targets like that were silly and trivial and pointless, and that what really mattered was what the bureaucracy was doing or what the law said. And I have gone completely 180 on that. Now, it's important not just to have the goal get set, but also that there's effectively internal enforcement of it. It needs to come up a lot in internal meetings, right? People need to get rounds of applause when they make progress. But for me, this administration has set a goal around 8 million acres of restored and protected wetlands. That's an example of a really big goal that has international audiences looking at it as a model for other countries. Next administration has the opportunity and really the need to say, how are we going to do that? Where do the 8 million come from? And then to figure out how to keep, I use the word enforcement, but it's not courts enforcement, it's within your team, right? Like the president is the boss, the supervisor, right, of CEO of everybody who works there. You should be able to get them to do it. So
Accountability.
Accountability. I think of goals like that is really crucial, and I'd love to see the next team say, we're going to do wetlands, have been bipartisan for much of the last 3 decades, saying we're going to take on this challenge of protecting and restoring 8 million acres of wetlands, 100,000 miles of rivers and streams. Yeah. That to me is a great example of a high-level political goal. But there could be lots of others in water infrastructure. You mentioned regionalization. So what can we learn from states like Oklahoma and Kentucky that have made enormous progress on regionalization? How does the nation, the federal government, support them? And working with the bipartisan set of governors on regionalization would be another example of something that a new White House could take on.
We want a 25% reduction in the number of water utilities, right?
Yeah,
just by bringing them together, like put that out there.
Yep.
Interesting. It's been said a lot that kind of water is having its moment. Right? I know Radica Fox at EPA would talk about this, and others with the infrastructure law, with all this momentum things happening. Where do you think we are in that moment? Do you think that we're still in it? Do you think it's passing by? Do you think a new one's coming? Just a very philosophical question for you.
Well, I'm still in it.
Okay. Me too.
Yeah, awesome. It is having its moment. Although at the end of the day, polls, when environmental groups hire pollsters, or when a nonpartisan entity hires pollsters and asks about the environment, climate change, wildlife, water is almost always the thing that people most identify as the thing they connect to. So there's a moment happening in Washington around water, but I think the average American has been having that moment kind of continuously for decades, and we've now realized that there's stuff we can do on it. So I am worried about people feeling like, especially because there's so much federal money, that other people can take their eye off that and work on other things. And my whole career has been, I've seen like the pull of the sexier work on climate, being a problem to describe it in a different way, which is it's pulled much of the human capital and much of the philanthropic money toward it. And I kind of thought that we had passed that, but I think that's still a risk, that it just absorbs too much of the support.
Does this play into how we move in trends and we move in eras of things, and we have attention spans, and water got to its moment? It's been having this big political moment for the past 3, 4, 5 years, whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, we're weary of that. There's this money. Let's move on to something else. But the people out there, right, are not done with water. So let's keep going. And that's a message to bring here to DC.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yep.
Cool. Tim, thank you so much.
You bet. This was fun.
You're in the water loop.